So, Chacha, we have handled the situation quite well.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is that there haven't been a loss of life. There's been delay, but obviously, this is a meticulous process. This is a very sensitive operation. The time spent cannot be blamed for as incompetence. But the fact of the matter is that if something like this happens again, which it will, it's as sure as death and taxes. We need to be better prepared.
Thank you. First of all, I share the joy of all the families of workers who were trapped. And a salute to all the brave workers who were inside. And I know that trauma will be handled. So first thing off, I also salute and applaud the agencies working together, all of them. NDRF was named, the Army was named, other agencies which were on site, digging alternate tunnels, trying out everything with caution. So that has to be applauded unambiguously. But also, I salute the efforts of the workers, informal workers themselves, what are called rat miners. Those are mine workers which are banned, but they use their extremely, skilled hands to get to the last stretch and risking their lives. So it has to be sort of applauded. And I think all these efforts of rescue, you said it, Vineetji, it takes time. But I think it has been well done and systematically done under a lot of media and so on and so forth. So very well done. I think there are two lessons. I think the Himalayas are sending very loud messages to all of us. We are trying to tame Himalayas, the Indian Himalayan region, and three big messages have happened this year. The sinking of Joshimath, and then you saw the glacial outburst in Sikkim. But let's not forget what happened in Himachal a few months ago. With the landslides and the kind of flash floods going around. So I think there's a very loud message. In the case of Char Dham project that we are talking about, the Silkaria tunnel here, you see the point in this whole thing is it's a 900-kilometer project. And I have, we know it's in a critical ecology. Himalayas are very critical. They are young, they are rising. They are among the fragile ecosystems which we need to protect. So what has happened is, I think the environmental impact assessment side of the story has been bypassed. And these 900-kilometer stretch has been considered into a series of what I read, 53 distinct projects, and therefore it enabled those bylaws. So on paper, in theory, on drawing boards, Char Dham is a good idea. But when it comes to putting it on the ground at 45-degree slopes in this precarious ecology, what it really leads to is deforestation. What it really leads to is this whole collapses and landslides that we see. So it is creating a lot of issues. And I think the lesson going ahead, and a loud lesson which is unaddressed for a long time, and I hope it's addressed emphatically now, is the lesson of planning with nature. Is the lesson of actually making a public conversation, but also regulations around the whole issue of what is the carrying capacity of the Indian Himalayan region. It's not just about numbers of people and population sizes, but the kind of infrastructure it can sustain, the kind of quote-unquote developed model that it can actually bear with. And I think that's the problem here. So I think there's a larger, deeper question going ahead, which thankfully in this case hasn't led to fatalities, and I really feel very good about it. But this is a conversation that we need to go on. The second important conversation, and briefly, Vineetji, in light of time, is this whole question of worker safety. See, largely, if you look at it, who is doing these tunnel constructions, the road constructions? These are migrant informal workers, whether from Bihar, whether from Jharkhand, whether from Eastern UP and other states. And not only they have very paltry social security systems, which most of informal workers have, and it's not only related to tunneling and road construction across sectors. They have very paltry social security system, and I think we need to sort of look at that. But also, when companies and private companies are involved within, there's an accountability there. They cut corners to cut safety standards, and these lead to fatalities. And I think these are the issues we need to sort of be regulating very, very strictly. Because you can, NHI and others can give it to private contractors, but what happens down the chain is for all of us to see, not just now, but across time. But also, Vineetji, there are good models. Please remember, not so long ago was built the Atal Tunnel in the Kullu region and the Lahaul-Spiti region. The company involved there ensured that those norms, first of all, those norms are not very well established. but at least they ensured those protocols are there, the exit routes when you're doing tunneling in such precarious situations. First of all, you need to see what the carrying capacity is, but secondly, you need to ensure exit paths. So did we have exit paths here? The workers got trapped. Did we have escape routes available? And I think that's where regulation, very strict regulation, very strict coordination between the construction companies, very strict oversight by the state agencies involved is needed. Else we will have more and more of this. The end of the day, in the Himalayan region, we do need, you see the vision of development itself, what it can do, what kind of way infrastructure can be created. I mean, concretes and roadways and buildings. How can it sustain? This whole issue needs much more imaginative attention in view of climate change, and we've been seeing this. This has magnified tremendously. So I think we need to be very, very sensitive. And Himalayas are not the only critical ecology in our country. I mean, take rainforest areas, for instance, or take mangroves, for instance. So I think we need to have a much broader ecological conversation, much broader workers' protection, safety, social security kind of conversation in all of these sort of arenas. Those are the lessons and conversation I would like to make going ahead, while celebrating the efforts of all of the rescue agencies, which is a task really well done.
Absolutely.
I'm so happy to see 41 people going to be come out alive. At some stage, we were all losing hope. So
Absolutely.
It's wonderful today. Thank you, Vinitji.
Absolutely. Mr. Chatra, your thoughts and feedback on what you've heard from the fellow panelists. This is a treacherous terrain. We've also heard that this is not going to be the last time something as precarious as this is attempted. But you've already enunciated, you've already articulated that better research and development, better practices need to be constituted. But you can still have the best practices, you can still have the best resources, you can have all the money. Accidents and Mother Nature is something which will recur from time to time.
Thank you, Vinitji. And in briefly, what I think is 2023, we were talking of traumatic travails, lessons. So I concur with the views of all my fellow panelists. In my past life, I used to be and still continue to romance mountains, and I was a rock climber and high altitude climber as well in my past life. So I completely agree with the views that many others have shared, the mountaineer Sangeeta ji and what Captain Jha was speaking, but the earlier speakers as well. I think the point I would like to make in conclusion, in this conclusion, is the question that, see, what has been done cannot be fully undone. Yes, there are lessons that the mountains are crying and telling us. So those traumatic lessons with a lot of loss of lives, not in this instance, thankfully, and hopefully it all goes very well. But there is a question of turning points. And I think at this point in time, 2023 and years before, tell us on the ground that perhaps development turning points with reference to Himalayas are sorely needed. And these may need balances, but they may need reimaginations of what kind of futures that we envision for our country as far as Himalayas are concerned, as far as people of Himalayas are concerned. So I think that reimagery or reimagination is the question. Do we want the replication of what's the usual development in other parts of the world or in our own country actually replicated in the Himalayas? Or do we need a different planning with nature in respect to nature? See, one of the lessons mountaineers have is never to trample nature, they don't use the idea of conquest of nature. So it is respect to the nature. So I think that is what we must begin in the Himalayas. It will be a message to the world. What kind of planning, what kind of development, and what kind of futures, developmental futures that we imagine for Himalayas. That's one conversation. And how do we make that happen in a graduated manner? I think that is where we need to focus our attention on. Lessons can be lost, lessons can be unheard, but that's the lesson from this, sort of safe rescue that we all need to take home and develop further, tease out further, debate further, plan further. We cannot be isolated from the realities of the ground and do planning. on drawing boards in remote planning circles. That's not the lesson we have. Ecological planning, ecological futures, and the need for ecological futures in the Himalayas is the one big lesson I would like to sort of take out from here for future. And I think we need to take out from here for future, but also the important lesson of question of what kind of social secure protected futures we imagine for the working people of India, and how do we make that happen? Because a large majority of the working people of India continue in the informal sectors, are hardly protected in the informal sectors. So all those bodies who sort of work with the workers need to be made accountable. And a large part of the work these days, as far as informal workers are concerned, is in the hands of what is called private corporations, private companies, which, as we have already spoken here, are cut corners of all kinds to make profits and to burden the workers with the risks associated. Thank you.
Right. Mr. Chachra, you've been advocate for, these safety guidelines. You've talked about how workers need to be insulated from these, perilous circumstances. Would you advocate that a robust policy, that has some teeth, needs to be implemented?
Thank you. I think the arena of business and human rights, and therefore the question of corporate accountability to human rights, the rights of workers, to standards of safety, of welfare of workers, is an area which needs immense attention and implementation. You have guidelines, you have broad guidelines. You see, there is the international guidelines, there are the national voluntary guidelines. So those guidelines are there. I think that's an arena which needs to be made into a regulation. I'll give you a media report. I was just looking through it. There was an RTI request, and I'm going by media reports, to the Ministry of Labour and Employment, Ministry of Labour and Employment's factory advice services in terms of workers' accidents. Now, the data tells us, the RTI data tells us that 3,331 deaths occurred between 2018 and 2020. But of these, only 14 people were held accountable and imprisoned under the Factories Act of 1948 during that period. I mean, this, of course, is a data you can look back further in history and you will find the same data. So the question of accountability and the question of how do you hold companies and contractors and individuals accountable is a big one. So guidelines is one thing, policies is one thing, and actually investigating implementation of those and holding, sending a message, but also holding those accountable which lead to such dilution of safety standards, such kind of, it's not ignorance, such kind of, sort of not working on it. That's an area of work which countries like ours need. Because otherwise, you are doing everything which is contrary to the interests of people who make our country, to the makers of our country, which are the workers of our country. A lot of them, and majority of them, and an overwhelming majority of them, upwards of 90%, are in the informal sector, poorly regulated, not protected, completely ignored, and working in conditions of extreme precarity. Now, those precarities vary across trades. If you go to the construction industry, there are different kind of precarities workers have. If you go to the tunneling, we were speaking, although the National, sort of Highways Authority of India has now ordered a safety audit of all the 29 active tunnels. So I hope something comes good of it. But I think they have been largely ignored. So it may lead, so it's like Khuda, Allah ke upar rakh diya, bach gaya to bach gaya, mar gaya to mar gaya. So I think that kind of a lackadaisical approach cannot be allowed. Whoever the contractors are, whichever the companies are, these are lessons of the past. If you look at this entire regulation of coal mining sector, I was talking to rack miners in my first intervention. See, that has been regulated now. So with the formation of the sort of public sector and the coal, what used to happen in the 60s, where miners were at great risk and accidents used to happen by the dozen, unreported, unacknowledged, without any protection, without any even compensation, that got regulated. So I think we need much better work, Vinayji, in that direction. And this is not theory. So we have the new labor codes, And we have the 4 new labor codes. And I think in those labor codes, there are certain broad guidelines given. I mean, there are a lot of debates on what can be made stronger. I think we need, in this particular aspect, with reference to protection, safety, the future of our workers, the welfare of the workers, that will determine how good, how futuristic, and what kind of a sort of future civilization that we build that we all can be proud of. And I think that's a big arena of work with reference to what you asked me of what's needed for workers, what's needed for those who make our cities, what's needed for those who make our roads, what's needed for those who make our buildings, what's needed for the unsung heroes, unacknowledged heroes, the women workers of India. With reference to women workers, we haven't talked it, that this is not the sort of occasion, but I think this whole arena of what kind of discrimination happens to women workers, the pay gaps that are there, the sexual harassment that happens, that needs complete overall, and we need to protect and build better futures for our women workers, but more generally for informal workers of our country. And I think I don't want to just draw this lesson from this one incident, but that's a broader issue that you asked me, and I think that's one issue that comes out from this instance as well.